Hi, I'm Bob Ross, and for the next 13 weeks, I'll be your host as we experience the joy of painting. I think each of us, sometime during our life, has wanted to paint a picture. I think there's an artist hid in the bottom of every single one of us. And here we will try to show you how to bring that artist out, to put it on canvas, because you too can paint almighty pictures.
I won't run from the storm. I arrive after it.
For millions of people, he was a voice of calm in a chaotic world, a man who turned blank canvases into peaceful landscapes and mistakes into happy accidents. But behind that gentle voice was a life shaped by discipline, loss, and a legacy that would become more complicated than anyone expected. This is the real story of Bob Ross. Robert Norman Ross was born on October 29, 1942, in Daytona Beach, Florida. Raised in nearby Orlando, he grew up far from television studios and fame, in a world filled with nature. His father worked as a carpenter. His mother was a waitress. It wasn't a glamorous upbringing, but it was grounded. As a child, Bob was quiet, observant, drawn more to animals and the outdoors than to crowds. He spent much of his time exploring the Florida wilderness, learning to appreciate trees, water, wildlife, the very elements that would later define his art. But his early life wasn't without hardship. Bob dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. He worked alongside his father as a carpenter, where he lost part of his left index finger in an accident. It was a small detail most viewers never noticed, but it was a reminder of a life far removed from the peaceful world he would later paint. At 18 years old, Bob Ross enlisted in the United States Air Force. He would spend nearly 20 years in service, eventually rising to the rank of first sergeant. Most of that time was spent in Alaska. Alaska would change his life forever, not because of the military, but because of the landscape. The mountains, the snow, the endless forests. These scenes would later become the backbone of his paintings, but the military shaped something else in him too. As a first sergeant, Bob Ross was responsible for discipline, authority, control, and by his own admission, he didn't like the man he became. He once said, "I was the guy who makes you scrub the latrine, the guy who yells at you for being late." After years of that, I decided if I ever got away from it, I wasn't going to yell anymore. That decision would define the rest of his life. While stationed in Alaska, Ross began experimenting with painting. That's where he discovered a man named Bill Alexander. Alexander hosted a television show and taught a method called the wet-on-wet technique, a fast, efficient way to complete oil paintings in a single sitting. For Ross, it was a revelation. He studied the technique, practiced constantly, and eventually began teaching it himself. But there was a problem. Ross loved painting, but he didn't love his job. By the late 1970s, he made a bold decision. He would leave the military and pursue painting full-time. When Bob Ross left the Air Force, he had no guarantee of success. He struggled financially. At times, he barely had enough money to survive. That's when he made one of the most unexpected decisions of his life. He got a perm. Not for style, not for fashion, but because it was cheaper than regular haircuts. Ironically, it became his trademark. Ross would later admit he didn't even like the hairstyle. But by then, it was too late. It had become part of his identity. Around this time, he partnered with business associates who would help launch his career. And in 1983, everything changed. That year, The Joy of Painting premiered on PBS. The format was simple: a blank canvas, a soft voice, and a man who made painting feel possible for anyone. There are no mistakes, just happy accidents. The show ran for over a decade, producing more than 400 episodes. But here's something many people don't realize. Bob Ross made very little money from the show itself. Instead, the real business was behind the scenes: art supplies, instructional books, painting classes, certification programs. The show was never about profit. It was about exposure. And it worked. Bob Ross became a household name. To the public, Bob Ross was calm, gentle, almost otherworldly. But off camera, he was more complex. He wasn't a completely different person, but he wasn't exactly the same either. He was disciplined, focused, and deeply involved in the business side of his brand. He also smoked cigarettes, something rarely seen by fans. The image of Bob Ross was real, but it was also curated. Bob Ross was married multiple times, but one relationship stood above the rest: his marriage to Jane Ross. She played a crucial role in supporting his career. But tragedy struck when Jane was diagnosed with cancer. She passed away in the early 1990s. Her loss deeply affected him, more than he ever publicly showed. Around the same time, Bob himself began facing serious health issues. Bob Ross was diagnosed with lymphoma. His health declined rapidly. Despite this, he remained largely private about his condition. The man who had spent years comforting others quietly faced his own mortality. On July 4th, 1995, Bob Ross passed away at the age of 52. He was laid to rest at Woodlawn Memorial Park. No cameras, no easels, just a quiet place, fitting for a man who brought so much peace to the world. When Bob Ross died in 1995, the world lost a gentle voice. But behind the scenes, something else was beginning. A quiet, complicated battle over who would control the legacy of the man who never sought control at all. The business behind the smile. By the time of his death, Bob Ross wasn't just a television personality, he was a brand, and that brand was tied closely to a company called Bob Ross, Inc. The company had been built alongside Bob during his rise to fame, and it controlled his name, his likeness, his image, his products, his teaching system. While millions saw a painter, there was also a business quietly growing behind him. Who was supposed to inherit his legacy? Before his death, Bob Ross made it clear, at least privately, what he wanted. He wanted his legacy to go to his son, Steve Ross, his half-brother, Jimmy Cox. Steve Ross had followed in his father's footsteps, even appearing on The Joy of Painting and teaching the same techniques. To many, it seemed obvious. The legacy would stay in the family. But what was written and what would ultimately happen were not the same. The shift after his death. After Bob Ross passed away, control of his name and likeness did not go to his son. Instead, it remained with Bob Ross, Inc. And that decision would define the future of his legacy. Steve Ross, his only son, would not inherit the brand that bore his father's name. Two different stories over the years, two very different narratives emerged. One side, Bob Ross, Inc. maintains that they helped build the brand, that they preserved and expanded his legacy, that they ensured his work reached millions around the world. The other side claims that Bob's wishes were not honored, that his son was pushed out of the legacy, that control of his name became something he never intended. The truth depends on who you ask. And like many stories involving money, legacies, and fame, it isn't simple. The documentary that reignited everything. In 2021, a new wave of attention hit the story with the release of Bob Ross, Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed. The documentary brought the controversy into the public eye in a way it never had been before. It focused heavily on Steve Ross's perspective, the emotional toll of losing not just his father, but his father's legacy, the business relationships that shaped the outcome. For many viewers, it was the first time they realized there was a darker chapter behind the happy trees. Bob Ross spent his life teaching people that mistakes weren't failures, that everything could be turned into something beautiful. But after his death, the question remained, what happens when the legacy itself becomes the mistake? Decades later, Bob Ross found a new audience through the internet, streaming platforms, and social media. A new generation discovered the man who made painting feel possible. His voice became a source of comfort, his presence timeless. Bob Ross never set out to become a legend. He never chased fame or attention. He simply painted and spoke and shared a quiet kind of kindness the world didn't know it needed. And maybe that's why, all these years later, we're still listening.
I think I'll sign this one. The old clock on the wall tells me it's about time to bring this show and this series to a close. I've really enjoyed being with you for the past 13 shows, and I hope to see you again very soon. If you get a chance, stop by Branson, Missouri, say hello to us. Until next time, I'd like to wish each and every one of you happy painting, God bless, and we'll see you soon.